Okay, hello. So today, this is my great pleasure to have a discussion with someone I admire a lot, who is also a friend of mine, Ralph Adolphs. Ralph Adolphs is Brent Professor of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Biology at the Caltech in California. As you can probably see behind Ralph, the always sunny California. And there, Ralph is the director of the Emotion and Social Cognition Lab, which investigates the neural underpinnings of human social behavior. One of the main questions that Ralph raises in his research is how people recognize, perceive, and process emotions. And with David Anderson, Ralph wrote a book called The Neuroscience of Emotion, a New Synthesis, that was published in 2018. And this is really a great book. Incidentally, Ralph is also a member of the Philosophy in Biology and Medicine network that we sort of coordinate from Bordeaux, France, where I am. And also a sort of disclaimer is that Ralph participated in the paper called Why Science Needs Philosophy that we co-authored with different other scientists and philosophers. So of course, this is very important to say that Ralph is not just any neuroscientist. He's a neuroscientist who is extremely interested in different aspects of the neuroscience, including in some conceptual and philosophical aspect of this discipline. So the overall aim of this interview is to explore with Ralph the role of conceptual and theoretical thinking in neuroscience on the one hand, and on the other hand, the role of philosophy in neuroscience. So Ralph, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Looking forward to chatting with you. I feel like I forgot my props, but I feel like I should have had a glass of red wine and a good brie and or at least a croissant and an espresso or something
Yeah,
here.
because at this time of the day for you,
Japanese green tea, which is not the same.
that's I know you like that, and that's kind of perfect for the interview. Better than the wine, I guess, for the interview.
No, I don't know. We should try it.
So thank you again so much for accepting to do this interview and to sort of go into these very broad questions that as a philosopher I have. So let's start with one of these very general questions, but I think this is a good way of sort of starting the discussion. So in current neuroscience, I would say, from the 1980s to today, uh, who are the main scientists, or maybe the main books or the main papers that strike you as being very much involved in sort of foundational thinking in neuroscience, in the sense that they would pay a lot of attention to conceptual aspects or theoretical aspects or critical aspects of the neuroscience?
That's a pretty big question, all right. Of course, it goes back to well before the 1980s, and I think the main thing that happened in neuroscience is cognitive neuroscience and computational and theoretical neuroscience with that. And cognitive neuroscience is basically what I and my lab do. And that, it's hard to put dates on that. There were certainly people talking about foundational issues, psychologists and philosophers primarily, well before then. But there wasn't that much known about the brain until modern methods came about. And then since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it's just kind of taken off. So the field would basically be computational, theoretical, and cognitive neuroscience. And there would be a lot of people. So here at Caltech, we have computation and neural systems as a graduate program, which many other universities have as well. And some of the key players were people like, Carver Mead, John Hopfield, Terry Sanalowski, and at least then, and to some extent also today, I think what distinguishes some of the main contributions is that these people didn't start in neuroscience. They often started in physics or mathematics, very quantitative sciences where you're used to writing down equations to describe the behavior of a system and trying to see how far you could go in applying that to the brain. And again, it was limited a lot by data initially, and then we have more and more and more data now. And so there's functional neuroimaging in humans. In humans, there are lots of dense recordings from cells in animals. And so given those data, the challenge is now, can we put equations on those? Can we understand, how the brain works in a way that ultimately, to paraphrase Feynman, we would be able to engineer one? Can we understand the human brain sufficiently that we could construct an artificial brain? And I think that theme in the last 5 years, it's accelerating extremely rapidly, has also led to the marriage of artificial intelligence and machine learning with neuroscience. So it's extremely rapidly evolving field that I think if you ask what's foundational conceptual thinking in neuroscience, the main, not the only, there are other conceptual strands, but I think the main approach is thinking of the brain as a computer, computational theoretical neuroscience, with papers that go way back. I think, just to name a few, I think one of the seminal papers, which certainly predates your date of 1980, but I think if you asked cognitive neuroscientists, they would say 1959, there was a paper by Jerry Letwin, Maturana, McCullough, and Pitts that was titled "What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain," and was aptly titled. And in this study, they were able to record from the frog's brain neurons and how they responded to visual stimuli like flies out there in the world, and asked the question, how does the frog know that there is a fly so it can catch the fly? And they found that there was already a lot of information at the level of the retina in the eye of the frog. There were cells that looked like feature detectors that were very specially designed to pick up, little dots moving like flies and so forth. And I think that, and then later the Nobel Prize, not that much later, maybe a couple of years later, the Nobel Prize winning work of Torsten Wiesel and David Hubel, who recorded in cats, same thing, they recorded to visual stimuli that they presented on the screen and asked, what do we see in the brain, in the visual part of the brain when we do that? And they characterized cells that had what they called receptive fields that responded to certain visual stimuli in certain parts of the visual field. So all of that to, make a sort of long preamble that then it really mushroomed out, given these data and given that people are recording what happens in the brain when we show something out there in the world. Computational and theoretical and cognitive neuroscience set it as their task to really try to figure out, how does the brain represent the world? And that's, probably that. And a big part of that question, of course, is how does the brain generate conscious experience, which used to be a subset question that people really relegated to philosophy until the 1980s, really, probably, when Pat Churchland published a book called Neurophilosophy in 1985 or 86. And then lots of other, neuroscientists and philosophers started investigating consciousness. So I'm giving a very long answer to your question, but it's a big question. So representation in the brain, how does the brain represent stimuli to guide action, is one big set of questions. And then together with that, the harder question of how, why, in what way is that accompanied, at least in some cases, by conscious experience of the world. So there's a lot that one could say about that. Maybe to cut to one paper, otherwise I'll keep talking here forever, that's recent, that looks at that. Let me see what the paper is called, actually. It's by the senior author, Stefano Fusi, and it's a paper that really set a lot of current theoretical neuroscience. 2013, it seems it was published, The Importance of Mixed Selectivity in Complex Cognitive Tasks. So as usual, this was authored by a bunch of people, but Stefano Fusi, who was a theoretical neuroscientist at Columbia University, is sort of often credited with the theoretical conceptual thinking behind this. And the gist of it is something like this. When people recorded from visual cortex, from the optic tectum in the frog, and so forth, they found neurons that whose responses were easily interpretable. And you had something on a screen, some dot, and this neuron responded just to that. And we could sort of tell a story for what is the function of this neuron. Its function is to detect flies and then tell the motor system of the frog, to catch the fly. When people started recording other parts of the brain, and in particular, the prefrontal cortex, this Stefano Fusi paper that I'm talking about was in the prefrontal cortex of monkeys, they found neurons that responded to lots of things, and their responses were not easily interpretable. And sort of much more similar in some ways to what you would find in the intermediate layers of a deep neural network nowadays. And the question was, how do we think about them? What do they do? And the upshot of the paper was that single neurons are not the way to think about how the brain works for a number of reasons. But one reason is that the neurons further on that get input, that ultimately are told by these neurons, what kinds of representations or stimuli are out there. These are mappings from many, many thousands or tens of thousands of neurons onto these readout neurons. So any neuron listening in my brain to other neurons from which they get input from thousands of other neurons, not just one. And so the question is, how does a neuron read out this population level neural activity? And the gist of this paper was that we need to record from many neurons in the brain, and we need to understand population level activity. So if the question is, how does the brain represent a fly or an object or anything out there in the world? The answer is something along the lines that it constructs a very high dimensional representation of many thousands or tens of thousands of neurons, that each of which respond in a mixed way in terms of their selectivity to stimuli out there in the world. And from that, we are then the brain is able to read out many different things flexibly, so that I can choose to recognize lots of different objects, classify them in different ways, in ways that they're both very specific and very abstract. It's a deep question, because right now, when I'm looking at you on the Zoom, I'm able to represent specifics. You have the sun in the background, and you have the bridge, and you have yourself, and it's a very specific representation. On the other hand, I know that you're Thomas and you're a philosopher, etc. And that level of abstraction has to somehow be possible in the brain as well. So papers like this, and again, Stefano Fusi's paper wasn't the only one in Nature when it was published. Again, let me look at the date, 2013. But it's one along a line of papers that is really foundational in asking, given we have the experimental data now and the methods, we're able to record from all these neurons in the brain, how does that answer, or how should we think about foundational questions about what does that tell the person, the rest of the brain? What does it represent? How could we read out information that this population of neurons represents about the world? And thinking about that conceptually and then coming up with tools to analyze those data, that would be one seminal thing. So this mixed selectivity by Stefano Fusi and colleagues is probably one, again, embedded in a big literature that one could point to. I should stop talking because I've talked for a long time here, but the question is very large. So.
The question is, the question is very large, and this is perfectly fine that you take the time you need to answer my questions. This is perfectly fine, no worries. So one thing I wanted to hear more about is to what extent you think that theories or theoretical thinking in neuroscience has often been done by people, as you suggested before. So this is why I'm asking about this again, people coming from a different field. I mean, physics probably being one, key example, but maybe people coming from mathematics or people coming from elsewhere. So this is really a question I wanted to ask you about, which is, is there a sort of theoretical thinking in neuroscience which is more internal and one which is more external, not in the sense that it would be not at the center of neuroscience, but it would be done by people trained with a different training. So is that the case? Is that not the case? Do we have a sort of gradient here? How does it work?
Yeah, it certainly is the case. I mean, I think historically it's certainly been the case. So, prior to lots of neuroscience methods and data being available, people like Donald Hebb, or before that, William James, right? They wrote about things that were about the brain, but there wasn't much known about the brain yet. So these were essentially psychologists. Psychologists were often studying the behavior of rats, or descriptions of what people report in psychophysics experiments, but it was psychology. And those psychologists wanted to understand, what it is that we could infer about the brain and what the brain represents given the behavior and the psychological data. Probably one seminal paper there would be Tolman's paper on cognitive maps, I think late 1940s, 1948 or so. I forget the exact title. It's something like Cognitive Maps in Rats and Men. But that started a whole line of research that's still extremely influential nowadays. Nobel Prizes were given out for it, and there's lots of work in animals looking at cognitive maps in regions of the brain, and lots of functional neuroimaging studies. Work, for instance, one could cite papers by people like Tim Behrens and colleagues that are very influential, major, big papers. So anyway, I need to stick to your question, or it'll keep going on and on. But so psychology, I think, had a big input. And then philosophy. I mean, I think it's fair to say that certainly for the neuroscience of consciousness, but also just for cognitive neuroscience generally, the input from philosophers has been huge. And it's basically been two strands. One is probably of more relevance to the philosophers than the neuroscientists. And that's like Pat Churchland's book, Neurophilosophy, that came out. So neurophilosophy is basically telling philosophers to pay attention to neuroscience and incorporate that into things. But then philosophy of neuroscience is a big field in philosophy of science in general, because I think a lot of the questions about how do we think about causation, reduction, all of these questions that exist across philosophy of science are especially acute in philosophy of neuroscience. And then there are specific, people like Peter Gerdenforce or others that have, thought about how do we think about a concept and how would that be instantiated. And then if you go to consciousness, for sure, all of the work in consciousness in neuroscience, and it's growing and growing. It's now a fairly respectable field with societies, big grants, journals dedicated to it. All of that really arose and is still mostly influenced by philosophy of mind, and more specialized versions of it. So all of the work that, books there would be, seminal books would be, for instance, David Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind. So he's a philosopher, but I think in that book was able to, articulate very clearly, amongst many other people, what the problem is supposed to be. He made the distinction between the hard problem of consciousness and the easier problems. And then that motivated lots of neuroscience work. So coming to your question, historically, without question, philosophy and psychology have had a huge impact. Then once computers came around, mathematics and physics had more of an impact. And right now, currently, all of these, I think psychology may be less so than it has been in the past. I think the input, the infusion in terms of conceptual thinking in neuroscience, for cognitive neuroscience, neuroscience of consciousness, it's really philosophy of mind, and philosophy of science more broadly. I mean, people like Carl Craver and others have spent a lot of time thinking about what counts as explanation, what is a mechanism, how do we think about the multiple levels in neuroscience that we need to account for. And then mathematics and physics. And I think there are many fields, certainly at the level of perception, but also at the level of decision-making. So decision-making and decision neuroscience are big fields now that are very strongly predicated on mathematical models that come from machine learning, economics, fields where you could write down equations to understand how evidence is accumulated, decisions are made, in what sense they are rational with respect to some objective. So formalizing all of that has been a major infusion from several disciplines, but they're all formal disciplines. Economic theory, mathematics have certainly put a huge input there. And again, it's been wedded nowadays very tightly with artificial intelligence and the question of how do we design artificial systems that would make decisions, and how does that process look like what actually happens in the brain? Same for perception, obviously. How do we design, nowadays, my cell phone can recognize faces, and some of these artificial systems are extremely good at object recognition, including faces. Whenever I fly internationally now, I have this global entry thing or whatever it is. I arrive in the United States immigration. I don't show my passport. I come in from a plane from Japan, and it just looks at my face, and it's Ralph Adolphs. And I go, how? I mean, that's an important question, right? If I just looked sort of like Ralph Adolphs, and I have the mask on in the plane, so my face is all weird, how does it do that? It's better than humans at recognizing individuals from their faces. So that huge success, I think, in AI is very closely interacting with neuroscience. And there's a bunch of people now, like Jim DiCarlo at MIT, many others, that are trying to make very strong parallels between what goes on in the deep neural network. Can we actually assign the kinds of representations we see in layers of a deep neural network that does face recognition to stages of processing in the human or the monkey brain? And the answer is yes, they actually bear a lot of similarity to one another. So again, a long answer to your question. The bottom line, though, is yes. Many people, neuroscience is highly interdisciplinary, and I think it's fair to say cognitive neuroscience is essentially interdisciplinary. It could not be done without input from other disciplines, for sure.
And would it be fair or a sort of oversimplification to say that philosophers, from this point of view, have mainly brought conceptual questions and conceptual clarification, whereas the mathematicians and physicists would have brought something different that might include conceptual clarification, but would be more, for example, about making predictions or making models, or what kind of differences?
Roughly, yeah, I think roughly that's true. I mean, by their nature, a lot of the philosophy has been more conceptual and framing and clarifying the questions, rather than providing algorithms for actually analyzing data or something like that. But again, I think a lot of the work on, take causation, which is often taken to be one of the key ingredients of explanation rather than prediction, that I would be able to construct a causal model, and that would explain to me, how the brain how a person sees, right? I would need to have some causal model about how visual input causes things in the retina, causes something else, boxes and arrows, a wiring diagram, something like that. And there's lots of work in philosophy, but it merges into computer science. In fact, one of the people that I collaborate with here at Caltech is in philosophy at Caltech, and yes, philosophical training. But if you look at what he does, you would say it's computer science. He basically looks at causal discovery and kinds of algorithms, how from data, from the statistics of data, we could infer causal models, what kinds of assumptions are required, and so on and so forth. I think just to say a little bit more about the contribution of philosophy, it certainly contributes big conceptual questions like the nature of consciousness and how to take that seriously and how to think about it deeply. And I think that's really important. And in part, it's because philosophers, at least that aspect of philosophy, can afford to be, or takes the liberty of being detached from the data to some extent. And so you have the freedom to really think deeply and pose very deep questions in a way that neuroscientists might find silly. They might say, oh, I don't think about that. Let's just go and look at the data and do the work. But you need to step back from the data and ask really difficult questions. And so that leaves you with questions, not answers. But I think that's important. You need to have the questions before you can have the answers. And then the next step, of course, which philosophy is famous for, is more methodological, which is it doesn't just sort of step back and, you sit there pondering metaphysics. But it also has a method that helps to clarify the questions and provide some structure as to how you might find answers, right? And I think the clarity for how to think about a problem is also something that philosophy has certainly contributed. And then I think that, for my own part, as you mentioned, we've interacted quite a bit. I used to be on the, it was called the McDonald Project in Philosophy and the Neurosciences, something that Kathleen Akins had back in the 90s. And I was involved in that. We went to meetings on the west coast of Vancouver Island each year and sat around and chatted about philosophical problems in neuroscience. And these were all young people at the time, young neuroscientists working on the brain, Adina Roskis, Thomas Metzinger, lots of folks that are now well-regarded senior philosophers working in neuroscience. And we did exactly the things that I just mentioned. We thought of the deep questions, ways to approach that. And it was just fun. So I think that ingredient, that philosophy should be fun. And if you're a neuroscience, if you're a graduate student or a postdoc in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience for sure, you should certainly be reading and exposed to and interact, I think, with philosophers, because it gives you the fun of actually thinking about really hard questions with a lot of freedom, and thinking about really foundational issues. How those then translate into tangible progress in neuroscience is, of course, a very circuitous and difficult route. But anyway, lots and lots of work by philosophers in terms of that aspect. There's another aspect that I should mention that I guess is not from philosophy. I guess it's from within neuroscience, which would also be considered foundational, but it's very different and it's not fun. It's boring. It's like that book that I recently read a book by a philosopher, Michael Strevens, I think is the philosopher, The Knowledge Machine. And he paints a picture of science as very tedious in a way, and data and observation and actual results are what the scientific method is, and it always trumps everything else. And so science is hard. Nature doesn't reveal herself to us very easily. We just need to crank through and see what the data tells us. And indeed, that's a thread that's been around maybe certainly for the last 10 years, and probably earlier than that. There are many people involved in that, but it's part of the so-called replication crisis that I suppose was most acute in psychology. People like Brian Nosek and many others started, the open science framework. The basic idea was, and this applies to cognitive neuroscience in spades, and these examples were often given. If you look at the literature on functional brain imaging, fMRI studies of human cognition, most of them are wrong. That's a fact. Most of them do not replicate. And when people realized this, it was hard to know what to make of it. How do you do science then if most of the things published are wrong, have a huge bias, and so forth? And people rose to the challenge and have risen to the challenge and said, well, the answer is you need to pre-register studies, you need to have replications of studies, and you need to really go through it very methodically and have very hard criteria that prevent you from conceptual thinking, that prevent you from playing around and trying hypotheses or exploring. It's something that you could imagine implementing in an algorithm that doesn't even need humans. It sounds extremely boring. And probably in cognitive neuroscience, one of the people that has had a big impact there is Russ Poldrack. He's a researcher now up at Stanford. So that's, I think, one domain that arose from within neuroscience, the realization how difficult it is to actually have a cumulative science where at the end of the day, you can really put confidence on your results, they would generalize. And to do that, you can't do it on your own. You need a whole community, and everybody has to be participating, in a very hard-nosed way. And that is a very different view than foundational thinking about the problem of consciousness, where it's much more creative, etc. And I think marrying those two sort of very hard-nosed approaches to how to get data and replication and get, conclusions that will stand the test of time on the one hand, and on the other hand, thinking about hypotheses and trying to make sense of and understand how the brain works, which is a lot more fun. Trying to meld those, I think, is one of the main challenges in cognitive neuroscience. But they're both foundational. One is foundational more in terms of the rigor of the methods, and the other more foundational in terms of what it is that motivates us to do cognitive neuroscience. If all we had was, the need to replicate and get data, it would be difficult to find people that want to do that. It's just not fun, right? So you need to have both, I think, which is, I think, what Michael Streben stresses in his book that I just alluded to as well, that neuroscientists are motivated by something that's in fact not, at the end of the day, how the science should be done. But both happen.
So yeah, so in a way you are already answering my question, which was, do you think that there will be a sort of division of labor where some people will do the fun stuff and some people will do more like thinking about the replication crisis? No, in fact, you're saying if we want to continue this work, I mean, everyone has to do both, right? This is what you're saying.
Right. I think, which side you're on and the balance of that varies, and as it should. And it varies in good part because people just have different personalities and styles. But yes, you need to have both, and the field certainly needs to have both. And the question is just how most productively bring them together. But you absolutely need to have both. Yes, you need to have the foundational conceptual thinking to come up with the questions in the first place. I mean, otherwise the search space is infinite. So you need to pose the questions. And at the end of the day, you need to have it to reflect on the data once you know that they replicate and are sound, et cetera, to interpret what it is that they actually mean and come up with the next generation of questions. And I think this is what, to me makes cognitive neuroscience so exciting and so fun, because you really do have both of those ingredients.
Very interesting. So one thing that you mentioned, among other things, was a role of philosophers in relation to neuroscience. But you also said something which I think is extremely interesting, which is that maybe we don't need the philosophers to do the philosophy. Maybe in a certain sense now, or maybe later, some philosophy would be useful within neuroscience, but maybe this is something that could be sort of integrated into the training of neuroscientists. And maybe in that sense, that philosophy would be better done by neuroscientists than by professional philosophers. So just what is your view about this? Do you think that we will need in the future philosophers interacting with neuroscientists, or we would need rather, or maybe both, philosophy done by neuroscientists themselves? And in which case, what kind of philosophy, what kind of philosophical training do you think would be needed to do this sort of more internal philosophy by the neuroscientists themselves?
Yeah, no, I think, as a field, if you step back, there is a lot of interaction between philosophy and neuroscience, but I would very strongly say that there should be much more interaction at the level of individual people. And so, mechanisms where you would have, I've done this myself, for instance, where a lab, like my lab, would host a philosophy graduate student. So I had a student who did her thesis with Thomas Metzinger. She was here for, I forget how long, 6 months, or, sort of a small visit. And we had interactions, lab meetings. So labs that do neuroscience, hosting philosophers, especially young philosophers or students doing their PhD in philosophy, I think that would be tremendously useful. And it's symmetric the other way around. I think that graduate students and postdocs, all of this would start early. So at the level of graduate students and postdocs. And once you had that, it would obviously translate up to when these people get old and are professors. But the other way around, graduate students and postdocs in neuroscience should also, I think it should be a requirement that they should get courses in philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. It just seems like an obvious added ingredient that would not only make their work more fun, but would really allow them to hook up and link up with other people and with a literature that's much broader than just their little particular niche. So I would be a very strong advocate of again, as a field, if you step back, you would say there's a lot of influence between philosophy and cognitive neuroscience, and that's true, but it's not there yet at the level of actually individual mechanisms like labs, graduate programs, actually making an effort so that people from philosophy or people from neuroscience could sort of swap over to the other side. So I think that's extremely important. Yeah.
And don't you think that some of your colleagues might say, and maybe with some reason, that this is partly a loss of time, that if you do that during your PhD, if you do that you're doing your postdoc, you're not doing, while you're doing philosophy or you're sort of thinking the big picture, you're partly losing your time because there are other things you should do, and that would be better for your PhD or your post. So is it something that you think people would say? Do you think it would be stupid, or it would have some rationality?
People would say that. I mean, I think it would be field, it would come down to the details of exactly which lab, which field, and what are you going to be doing. But I think the argument against that would be twofold. One is to just list the benefits and say, foundational thinking background in some of these conceptual issues, and also the methodological rigor that philosophy would provide, in fact, do bring a benefit to neuroscience. And I think that's a pretty reasonable argument to make, certainly in cognitive neuroscience. If you're doing if you're working on perception or representation or consciousness, you need to have philosophy as your background. Otherwise, you're just uneducated. So I think it depends to some extent on the field. But the other argument, I think, would be something I alluded to earlier. It's broader than just saying it would be fun. It would be fun. So that counts for something, right? I think people would be stimulated and motivated. But it would also just sort of expose them to what I think needs to be defended, which is that a big part of science and a big part of neuroscience should just be wondering about big questions rather than being able to justify some application or curing some disease, etc. So the value of basic research really does pose these foundational questions. We're just curious about, how does the brain work? How is it that I can perceive, that people can think? How does language work? How do feelings work? All these sort of foundational basic questions. And it should be, a value should be assigned to that. We have discussions often at my lab meeting about this issue. I think Nature just had some recent editorial on this. Trying to remember now. There's a famous letter. I can't look it up right now, but you can look it up. There's like a book of letters called Letters of Note. And in that, there's a letter from somebody from NASA. It's entitled something like Why Explore Space? And it's in response to the question of why do you spend billions of dollars, trying to send spacecraft up and maybe go to Mars when this money could be spent better trying to, help hungry people on Earth, something along those lines. And, it tries to mount a defense for why we need to do this. I guess in that sense, it comes down to defending science or coming up with arguments for why basic science, as opposed to applied science, is valuable. That's the same thing that somebody would say with respect to art. You should be able to have an argument that there's an intrinsic value to just, part of human nature is to be curious about ourselves and the world and think about deep foundational issues without needing to say, exactly what the application is. And I think that's really important. And so philosophy would be exactly that. It's posing big, difficult questions that are part of what makes us human, to puzzle about and to think about. We have that capacity, and I think it's part of our nature. And valuing that and taking time out to actually do that, this would also help. If you're in a neuroscience lab and all you're doing is focusing on methods and data, and that's it, you're to some extent leaving that part out, especially if all you hear is the purpose of this is to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease, or the purpose is, to build something. That's an extremely narrow applied goal. And of course, it's well known that those applications arise from basic research as a side effect. But I think one wants to make a stronger argument that there's a value to just thinking about conceptual foundational issues. That's part of who we are. It's the same answer to, why have culture and why do art, right? independently of an application. And philosophy values this and helps us teach how to think about those questions in a way that we're not guilty thinking about them, I think. So I think that's really important.
It reminds me of something that you told me several times, and I think we mentioned that in the PNAS paper I was alluding to before, the idea of Carl Wurst that biology should not be turned into an engineering discipline. So do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would basically say the same thing that I just said. Caltech here is both science and engineering. And a lot of the people I collaborate with, are engineers. So there's certainly a lot of applications, and there's no question. The work that we do, we work on autism. I collaborate with Pietro Perona, looking at some machine learning algorithms. These all have clear applications, about a disease, or designing eventually some machine learning algorithm to recognize emotion from videos or whatever it is. And those are fun and those are important. But again, I think if that's all you had, it would be bad for two reasons. One is that it would take away the motivation and the mystery of big foundational issues that just motivate basic research, and it would stifle the space in which you could explore. And again, coming back to something we said earlier, I think together with having this sense of freedom for foundational thinking that philosophy values, and I think can teach science to some extent, is just a way to explore lots and lots of options. So I think coming up with the right questions, exploring what is an unbounded space in which you can ask questions, requires that kind of thinking. Otherwise, you're going to be much more narrow. And I guess the data or the evidence for this would be the fact that many, maybe most, very famous applications and inventions arose from basic research. That it wasn't possible to conceive of where they might go because nobody knew that this would be possible. So I think the foundational thinking in all of science, but I think biology in particular, because of its complexity, is really critical. There are many, many applications, but if you set as your goal ahead of time, I want to cure this disease or find this particular molecule, you're not going to find a lot of other things that might be around there because you just aren't thinking of them. So the foundational thinking, I think, has to come first. And it's not, as I said, it's not incompatible with, but it's actually helpful for all of the applications.
That's very interesting. Two questions about your work on emotions, two related questions, of course. So one is, what is, in that specific case, what has been for you the value of clarifying the concept of emotion? So conceptual clarification that we mentioned before. And second, and this is very much related, one thing that strikes me in your work is that comparative biology is important for you. So a lot of what you did was to say, okay, emotions could be just human, but it's probably not the case. And there's a way in which, by being comparative, by sort of examining what you call emotion primitives, I think in one of your papers and in your book, you say there is something to gain from this comparative approach. So I wanted to hear you about this conceptual clarification and the value of comparative biology, especially when we want to have that sort of foundational thinking / theoretical thinking that we mentioned before.
Right. Yeah, that was a lot of fun to write that book. I wrote it primarily when I was on a 4-month sabbatical in Kyoto, Japan. And I wrote it together with the person whose office is immediately next door to mine here, David Anderson, who works on emotion, but not in humans. He works in mice and in flies even. And so we came from very, very different species and different backgrounds. So his background really for studying emotions was very mechanistic and very neurobiological. And my background was more infused with psychology. And if you broadly look in the literature on emotion, those are two sub-disciplines of emotion that should be brought together, but are not. So people working on emotion in animals and looking at neural circuits publish in completely different journals. than people working on human emotions, even if they do fMRI studies, but most of the work is just psychology. A lot of it is social psychology. It's in psychology-aligned journals. And so bringing that together was tremendous fun. And both David Anderson and I firmly believe that that's the only way ultimately to understand emotions. You do have to make comparisons across species. And that theme, I think, is one that many people who think foundationally in neuroscience would subscribe to, that what we are after is something like fundamental principles in neuroscience of how does the brain represent, what are concepts, what is emotion. Those questions, the answers to those questions should be broad enough that it's not just about modern adult humans or college students that I happen to study in the lab, but something that generalizes across species, and in doing so gives us an answer to how it came about in the first place. Yes, I think it's extremely important to have comparison across species, and to some extent, I haven't done this myself, but I do think it's very important, also comparisons across the lifespan. So both evolution and development would be essential to give you a broad picture, because things didn't come out of nowhere, to understand what were the building blocks throughout phylogeny, how did this develop, from birth on, to give you an answer how something is actually created, rather than just taking a single snapshot in an adult human brain when everything is all wired up and ready to go. There was a second part of your question that I'm forgetting.
No, the two are related, because in fact, I think you're just illustrating what I had in mind, which is that if you want to be comparative, you have to be definitional. If you don't have a definition, you're not going to be able to say, okay, flies have emotions in that sense. You're going to have to say that. Whereas if you're not comparative, I guess it's easier to not define. So I was just asking about, the role of conceptual clarification of the term of emotion in your work. But I think in a way you already addressed at least partly that question. But maybe you want to say more about this, conceptual clarification about emotion.
Well, I think a lot of it would be by contrast and making comparisons. There's not a necessary and sufficient condition type definition, but nobody would expect that for emotion or any other concept. But you can certainly delimit it more and come up with operating characteristics and comparisons. So the questions are obvious, and everybody would ask them. Is hunger or thirst or pain, are those emotions? Can a dog feel emotions? Can an ant have emotions, right? And so you're already starting to try to delimit what emotions are by contrast to these other things. And when you do that, you start coming up with criteria. So you might say yes, because it has these particular properties, or no, because it has some other properties. And I think that's basically the example that David Anderson and I went through in our book. We tried to delimit what we think is a reasonable, at a starting point, and it's iterative, concept of emotion when we look across species, and then asked ourselves how they distinct from other kinds of internal states that we might not want to call emotions, and why. What are the operating characteristics? So we listed a bunch. We had a table in the book, a lot of which is in agreement with what other people have written. Emotions have a certain similarity structure of valence and intensity. They generalize, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just like a laundry list, in a sense, of what it is that they can do. But backing out from that then would essentially be a functional definition of emotions. In order to have all of these characteristics that we see that we think constitute emotions, loosely, what is it that you need to be able to do to be able to have that? And so, that I think is the sort of program in our book, that once we specify, look, evolution across species came up with mechanisms for instantiating these internal states that we call emotions that have certain operating characteristics. Roughly they're ways of controlling behavior that are more flexible and generalizable than reflexes, but less so than just open thinking in humans. And what would you need in a system functionally in order to instantiate that? So that's the kind of program that we had there. But it does require abstraction and comparison across species. There's a colleague of mine here at Caltech, Marcus Meister, who's also very synthetic and abstract in his thinking about how the brain works. And he started a course maybe 3 years ago or so called Principles of Neuroscience, where he tries to do exactly that. He said, what are the basic principles that distinguish neuroscience as a science from other aspects of biology or chemistry and physics? And that all requires abstracting across species, trying to find generalizable principles of how nervous systems, what is it that nervous systems do? Why did they evolve? What is it that we can find shared across species? And then, of course, a part of that enterprise is also saying what might be unique in the case of human nervous systems, of course. But to get to that question, you have to understand what it is that we have in common. So.
Yeah, you don't necessarily start with uniqueness as a sort of, yeah, of course there is this uniqueness, and then we're going to explain it. It's much better, I think, to have this sort of comparative approach and then progressively, come and say something more specific about humans if needed.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
we're arriving at the end of this interview, but I still have one very general question. I'm sorry about this. All my questions are very general. I really apologize for that. But the final question would be, do you think that in the current field of neuroscience, with all its diversity, I mean, you mentioned the subfields and, different people, I perfectly agree with that. But overall, would you say that this is a field where foundational thinking is valued, not valued? Is it valued enough? Should it be valued more? Is it more valued than in other biological sciences? Or maybe you don't know. I mean, what is your view about the kind of value of foundational thinking that neuroscientists currently have?
It's valued. It depends on the subdiscipline, but certainly in cognitive neuroscience, theoretical computational neuroscience, it's definitely strongly valued. I guess two comments. One is, yes, it should be valued even more, and in particular in terms of the details of how scientists go about their everyday business, in particular in educating students. So like what we were saying before, neuroscience students should take philosophy courses. Philosophy graduate students should be hosted in neuroscience labs. There should be more mechanisms for interacting between these disciplines, even sort of at the bottom level. And then the other one is, I guess, somewhat of a threat. I mentioned before that there's a strong emphasis now on data-driven, atheoretical, not hypothesis-driven work. Lots of emphasis on replication, on big data. And I could see that being a threat to at least some aspects of foundational thinking, in that, everything should just be, the data should just speak for themselves. Everything should just be built on data. And to some extent, if you look at some of the largest movements recently in neuroscience, like the Brain Initiative that we have here, has lots of funding. I've had grants from the National Institutes of Health. It's been focused, that it's changed a little bit now, but it's been really focused in the past on methods. How do we measure everything about the brain? How do we generate data? And the worry would be that these are of course good aims, but the worry would be they might to some extent come at the expense of attention to foundational thinking. So I think, where we're poised now in neuroscience is, okay, we have a lot of methods now. We have dense neuronal recordings. We can record from thousands of neurons in a rat or a mouse. We have optogenetics for manipulating neuron activity very precisely in these animals. Now what, right? And I think now we want to kind of come back and say, given these tools that we have now, we should actually take a breath and step back and return to foundational questions. And to some extent, that's happening. To some extent, there's a lot of work, including funding initiatives, like from the Brain Initiative, that are valuing more questions about how to analyze the data or how to think about the data. So, it's dynamic, and I think it's going to keep, going in waves. But right now, my feeling about neuroscience would be to indeed take a deep breath, take a look at all the methods that we have. And right now we have more data and more methods than we know how to answer questions with them, and actually put more of an emphasis on foundational thinking and return to big, deep questions about how do we think about how the brain can represent anything in the world, how representations can dynamically progress in time so as to constitute a train of thought or some kind of language of thought. And of course, ultimately, how does conscious experience arise from all of this? So I think coming back and valuing foundational conceptual questions even more than we have in the past is something that will be really exciting to do over the next couple of years, because we have a lot more data and tools available than we did even five years ago.
That's great. It was a great discussion. Thank you so much for this discussion, Ralph. And also, I must say, you make me more optimistic about where we're going and what the future will be like, which is very good. So really, Ralph, that was great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. And really, thank you for your insights on this, these very broad questions, to which I think you answered very specifically in a very useful way. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Thomas. You made me start my day here at Caltech on a happy, positive note. I will be now in a foundational thinking mode for the rest of the day.
Great.